thanks so much. I'm really delighted to see you all, to the extent I can see you, and really honored to be here at the Art Institute with this amazing exhibit upstairs that I had like 20 minutes to look at, but connects in all sorts of interesting ways. I'm going to spend more time there tomorrow. So 100 years ago, almost exactly, though it depends on when you start the event, many of the people who tried to make and did make the Russian Revolution, or maybe revolutions, it was an ongoing, multiple process, believed they were starting something incredible and unprecedented in human history, For the short term, they were in the midst of the horrors of World War I, and they thought they could end the war. But it was never just that. They thought they could end all wars. That's part of the purpose of the revolution. One of the key demands, as you probably all know, in 1917 was bread. Give us bread. In other words, food. We're hungry. We're suffering economically. It's probably the main demand on the streets in 1917. But it was more than that. It was about people shouldn't have to demand bread. There should be an end to poverty in the world. By November of 1917, the main demand was this idea of give all power to the Soviets. You've probably heard this expression, these elected councils of workers, soldiers, eventually peasants, give all power. But there was a bigger idea, not just let's solve our crisis, but establish a world where the people, the majority of the population, not just the rich and powerful, determined how life would unfold, how history would develop. In fact, many people really did believe that they were starting in the unbelievably unpropitious conditions of a catastrophe of world war, a horrible catastrophe of war. They believed they were starting a worldwide wave of revolutions that would change the entire world forever. It would be a new era in history. In other words, I think you can hardly exaggerate, sorry about that. There they are. Hardly exaggerate the extent to which people were driven by incredible, you see some of their slogans and marches, dreams, hopes, beliefs. And of course, in time, the disappointment that goes with such high desires. And I'm going to come back to that. A good place, I think, to try to understand this world of belief, this world of imagination, this world of daring, is not 100 years ago, but exactly 99 years ago. So we're marking, commemorating, celebrating, mourning, as you wish, an event that happened 100 years ago. Of course, the October Revolution took place in November in Russia because one of the things that happened is that, or it was October in Russia, November in the West, Russians decided the government to leap across time, at least 13 days anyway, in order to join the same, as they say, civilized calendar in the West. So the October Revolution happened in November. When they commemorated it, the calendar had changed. So November 7th, 1918, that's the first time they thought about what is the meaning of that event, 1 year on only. And as part of the official project, Lenin had this idea we would do something called monumental propaganda, and monumental propaganda was basically a form of how do you educate people in thinking about the meaning of revolution, about how to transform the world in this way, through monuments, statues, plaques, all sorts of things. And there was this idea that on Red Square, in the very place where the people who fell, the martyrs of the October Revolution, people who died fighting, were buried in a large grave, there needed to be a big memorial plaque. And the Moscow Soviet was asked, the Council of Workers and Soldiers Deputies of Moscow, was asked to run a competition. And what you're looking at, and this is on Red Square, on the Senate Tower, what you're looking at is the winning entry, which was installed there by a guy named Sergei Konyonkov. It was unveiled, as you can see, on November 7th, 1918, in the presence of Lenin, in the presence of the leaders of the party, of the leaders of the state, on this first anniversary. And you can see at the center of this image is this large figure, suitably androgynous, which I think is important here, with huge white wings, gigantic white wings filling the whole center of this bas-relief sculpture. wearing a crown made of eagle feathers, with a sun rising behind, which has written on it the words October Revolution. And the figure is holding, as you can see, a palm branch in one hand. You can see, these are heavy symbols, not even subtle ones. And palm, of course, is martyrdom and victory in heaven. And then the other hand is a much more radical symbol, the red banner, revolution, socialism. And of course, it's red because it symbolizes the blood of all those who have fought for social transformation. And at the figure's feet are all the fallen weapons and swords, because war shall be no more. And as you can see, the plaque is dedicated to the fallen in the struggle for the peace and brotherhood of peoples. This is what the government chose, to be on Red Square, facing, overlooking the dead. By the way, not coincidentally, it was glazed to match the colors of St. Basil's Cathedral. You all know what that looks like. Exact same colors. And this wasn't just not only not coincidental, but the jury loved that part about it. The jury thought, that is really great, echoing St. Basil's. And what Konyonkov said was, while it echoes the colors of an ancient church, 16th century church, these are the new colors of life, awakening in us revolutionary feeling. Now, the ceremony that dedicated this work included the performance of a cantata, written by a collective of working-class poets, 3 working-class poets who met together, developed this song and the music as well as the words, and it was then performed by a workers' choir from the Proletkult, which was the proletarian cultural movement. And so you get like Konyonkov's Angel of Revolution. He didn't call it the Angel of Revolution, that's my name for it. Behind them, and the revolutionary dead lying at their feet, this choir sang of what? Crucifixion and resurrection in 1918, with lines such as you can see here: "Come down from the cross, crucified people, be transformed. Roar, land with the final storm, let a new day shine in the azure, the old world transfigured." As I said, it's hard to exaggerate the sense, the type of transformation in every aspect of the world that people believed, even officially, the revolution was trying to accomplish. Still, it might actually surprise us to say that among the canonical official images of the Russian Revolution in Moscow, which was then the capital, seen by absolutely everybody who came to Red Square for a very long period of time, Lenin's mausoleum eventually is built. If you look, it's hard to see, but you can see it right behind Lenin's first mausoleum, and then at the end of the 20s, it's over there on the right. This was there in Red Square for a really long time, and it might surprise us to think that this is the sort of imagery of the Russian Revolution's understanding of what it was trying to accomplish. It's not the least bit surprising. It is now. In fact, I just gave a talk in Moscow where I talked about this image, and Muscovites had never heard of this thing, most of them, because it came down in the 1930s, but it's not taught about. But actually, there's nothing surprising from the point of view of 1918 or, frankly, into the 1920s. The iconography of revolution, of the Russian Revolution, meant to embody and visualize and communicate the world of belief of the Russian Revolution, was full, surprisingly full to us today, of winged and flying figures, including resurrected ones. At least one other proposed design for that place actually also had a large female figure, this case clearly female, with huge wings floating above the city while the revolution takes place below, that there's sort of a winged angel of revolution. Public art. Other public art for the first anniversary also, as you can see some of it from here, from Petrograd, also included winged figures, angels perhaps, sometimes with trumpets. Again, presumably, what are they, sounding victory? Or probably, I think, like the archangels, Michael and Gabriel, sounding the last judgment, sounding the final defeat of evil in the world. And of course, as the originals, sounding resurrection. Now, this imagery was not just for then. It had a deep history. In fact, one might argue there's a whole revolutionary tradition, very strong in Russia, and in fact, a particularly strong, not among intellectuals, but among working class poets and writers and artists and musicians, of linking revolutionary change, the most radical sorts of revolutionary change, transcendence of the whole world as it is now, universal emancipation, linking those big, massive, transformative ideas to flight and to wings. For example, just to give you a few examples of hundreds, really. A worker writer, long since forgotten, named Alexei Gustav. He was a railway worker, worked in Kharkov, now part of Ukraine, wrote a novel in 1912 called Toward the Open Road. And there's one scene in the novel where the worker hero, who the novel is about, participates in his first strike. And how does he describe that experience? He says, "I felt as if wings had sprouted on my back and I could fly above the factory." Or, in 1914, on the eve of the war, the trade union paper of the St. Petersburg Union of Metalworkers published a poem by the union president, Alexei Gustav is his name, with lines, this is just one little bit of this larger poem, in which he declares, "Higher still, yet higher. In the smoke of victory we dash from the highest rocks, from the most treacherous cliffs to the most distant heights. We have no wings? We will. They will be born in an explosion of burning wish." Again, I could quote endless examples that are very similar from the pre-war and wartime years. In 1917, as you can see at the bottom there, such imagery became even more common. It wasn't fading away, it was becoming a more obsessive type of imagery. In May, for example, of 1917, that's between the February overthrow of the Tsarist government and the October overthrow of the disappointing provisional government, a newspaper called The People's Cause, published by a other socialist party, not the Bolsheviks, but a left-wing socialist party called the Socialist Revolutionaries, featured a poem by another worker poet named Pyotr Aryeshin. And he, because the Socialist Revolutionary Party was trying to unite workers and peasants, he wrote about the feelings of peasant revolution in words such as you see here. "Across fields I'm flying. On the fiery wings of time," hold that image in your head, fiery wings of time, because I want to talk about time. "From above hang fiery streaks, a pink glow towering round." Now, I do realize this is bad poetry, but I'm a historian, not a literary scholar, so I don't have to only give you good poetry. It's really revealing of not just the thinking, but the feeling at a very strong level at the time. And then comes the October Revolution, and it gets even more common. Now you've seen that big image on, by now you think, oh, it's actually that big image on Red Square was a cliche. This stuff's getting so common. An example from after the October Revolution, this is from 1919, a poet named, also a working class poet, named Vasily Alexandrovsky, traveled all over the country reading one of his most popular poems, which was called, what else? Wings. And in that poem, what happens is that the bloodshed of war and the bloodshed of revolution, remember the martyrs lying at the feet of the angel of revolution, are overcome, are transformed when the human blood of every person turns into lava, empowering lava, and everyone grows wings. Often, as you can see here, these wings were made of fire. Fire wings were very common. In fact, this word, ognyakryly, fire-winged, was applied to just about everything you can imagine. There were fire-winged people, there were fire-winged factories, there were fire-winged ideas, and of course, there's fire-winged time. And as you can also see already, these images of wings, these images of flight, were connected to resurrection again and again. Just again, one example out of many. A guy named Makai Arasam, working class poet, used to be a railway worker, a metal worker, was a leader in the proletarian cultural movement, and was one of those three poets who wrote that cantata performed under Kononkov's sculpture on Red Square in 1918. He wrote a poem, I guess the title Wings was already taken, so he called it We Fly. Letime. And it was published in a collection called Fire-Winged Factory. And the story it tells is basically how a worker, before the revolution, is experiencing all the suffering and inequalities and hardships of life, and he needs to escape. And the way to escape is through resurrection and flight to the sun. With words like, all were stooped and cramped, entombed in the factory crypt, when suddenly his blue blouse shroud tore, and resurrected, he sped towards the sun. What is going on? How are all these, and everybody I've quoted identifies themselves as a communist. Godless communists, they like to call themselves. In fact, godless wasn't enough. They were militant godless communists. It was a whole organization with that name. Why would militant godless communists be embracing, obsessively so, angels, human flight, wings, resurrection? So one way to answer this is to think about even bigger histories of that sort of imagery, that sort of world of symbols, those metaphors. Mircea Eliade, a Romanian historian of religion who spent many years teaching here in Chicago, argued in one of his studies that magical flight, that's what he called it, magical flight can be found in every culture. It's part of everybody's sacred stories. It takes different forms. Sometimes it's metaphoric, sometimes it's quite literal. There are shamans who could fly. And what does it denote, he argued, but basic things you can imagine. Freedom from evil, the ability to fly out of a world of evil. Mysterious knowledge and power. Not everybody can fly. There's a special, it's like a worker when you strike, suddenly then you have the power to understand how to change the world. You develop wings, this sort of imagery, knowledge. And probably most relevant and most to these stories is, he argues, magical flight in every culture represents transcendence above the sort of physical bonds, the physical material limitations of the world as it is given to you, the world as it is now, including everyday space and everyday time. For Russia, obviously, to be more particular about it, for Russian writers and artists, but also many ordinary citizens, obviously the Christian ideas of angels is a very important source and also helps us think about what these images might have meant. In particular, the importance of archangels, which are very ubiquitous in Russian icons and Russian culture, and symbolize God's presence, symbolize the promise of salvation, and also symbolize the idea that ordinary secular time, the here and now of this world, can be replaced by a new time which might be called messianic time, the time of the Messiah, of a complete transformation. To give an even more particular example, very close to the time of the Revolution, so setting aside this deep Christian culture, and outside formal church art, avant-garde and symbolist artists of all sorts were often using images of wings and flight and angels. Perhaps one of the most famous examples, which everyone would have known, including Konyonkov when he did his work, was Natalia Goncharova's Mystical Images of War, it's a published book. There's a copy in the Art Institute, sometimes on display, in which it's quite obvious, besides there's endless images of angels and war, there's also a very clear representation of Archangel Michael, known by his winged horse, the horse has wings, with his trumpet, remember all those trumpets, and a Bible and a censer. Another possible influence, because also well known in Russia, but even if it's not a direct influence, it helps us think about what does this imagery mean? People don't always know where they're getting their ideas from, but we can ask what inspired this type of thinking and feeling, and that would be to look to Friedrich Nietzsche. And in particular, the most influential idea Nietzsche ever crafted, in fact, most of what he said was forgotten except for it in some ways, the Superman, the Übermensch, in Russian, the Sverchchelovek, it's all a literal translation of the German. And one of the things that people noticed about the Superman, and this is a quote from Thus Spake Zarathustra, is that the Superman, the Übermensch, was an enemy of the spirit of gravity, who would one day teach men to fly. And I'll come back, maybe, to Nietzsche's Superman, because I think it's only fair to bring in a tradition much closer to the explicit identification, the explicit belief system of the people I'm talking about, and many who participated in the revolution and imagined it and led it, including Konyonkov that I've been describing, and that is Marxism. We might think Marxism would be a very different set of ideas, but in particular I have in mind this line that you see here, the Marxist idea that revolution is humanity's leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Humanity's leap. This idea, and in fact, it's probably better to remember that this is a metaphor. And metaphors, as a friend of mine, a literary scholar, reminded me, are often described by literary scholars as conceptual leaps. So metaphor is itself a leap device. So this metaphor of the leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom would be repeated many, many times, maybe one of the more core ideas in Marxism. And perhaps the most interesting repeating and interpreting of this image of the leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom is by Walter Benjamin, who you see I've quoted there, a German Marxist philosopher who wrote an essay on time, though he called it on the concept of history, but it's as much about time as anything else. In the year of 1940, so I'm using later things to interpret backwards, but 1940, think about it, because I think this is relevant, was a very, very dark time in the history of the world, especially if you were a Marxist and a Jew, as Benjamin was, and a very dark time in his own personal life. Benjamin described revolution as a leap in the open air of history, the source of the title of my talk, actually. That's the leap I'm thinking of. A leap, he says, that offers humanity, you can see some of his words there, a momentary possibility, just a momentary possibility, in his words, to blast open the continuum of history. History, in other words, is just step-by-step progress, or maybe step-by-step disaster. And to grasp, as he put it, the splinters and flashes of messianic time, those are all his words, a time open towards future possibility. It's very important to note what is, I think, a difference between Benjamin and Marx, or at least Benjamin in the way Engels interpreted Marx, which I won't get into. For Marx and Engels, I'll put them together, the emphasis is, as you can see in the quote, it sort of implies the destination, right? Aus, in. The utopian kingdom of freedom. That's what really matters in revolution. And many have argued, I think justifiably, that when you believe so powerfully in the end, in the destination, you will do all sorts of often terrible things to ensure that you get there. Benjamin's point is a little different. Namely, I think it emphasizes the leap itself, the leap into the free and open air of history. Unter, he says, unter dem freien Himmel, a very complicated, multi-layered phrase, but not primarily focused on the end. And then, of course, there is Benjamin's own famous angel. From that same 1940 essay, where he's interpreting Paul Klee's 1920 monoprint called Angelus Novus, a picture Benjamin so admired and so pondered so many times, wrote about it repeatedly, that he bought the original, and everywhere he moved, it was hanging on the wall of his apartment. And the angel of history, he says, this is the angel of history, this Angelus Novus, who is being, he says, forced irresistibly into the future by a storm we call progress. But the angel keeps looking backward in time, backward in history, and, quote, famous line from this piece, sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurling it in front of the angel's feet. The angel would like to stay and awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. That, I think, is what revolutions, certainly the Russian Revolution, tried to accomplish. Resurrection, flight out of the storm of necessity and progress, as it's conventionally been, making whole what has been shattered by the stubborn forward march of time. For Ernst Bloch, to bring just a couple more people to help deepen what I think these images mean, and then we'll go back to the streets. For Ernst Bloch, another German Marxist philosopher from Benjamin's circle, this is how you have to define utopia. This is what utopia means, which is to say, not Not our conventional notion of utopia is the impossible dream. It's a thing that'll never happen. It's wishful thinking. But utopia, Benjamin says, Bloch says, and I think you can see it connected to all of these ideas and back to Konyonkov and all those crazy poets. What utopia is an impulse, a deep, innate human impulse found in all cultures to, as he puts it, venture beyond the darkness of the lived moment, to discover some emerging not yet. And the problem, he argued, as many theorists of utopia have since, is that we live in the world of the present. And the world of the present sets our expectations, what we think is possible. We think what is probably all that is possible. And so he says, we have a tendency to mistake the not yet, the possible, the imminent, for we think it's just impossible. Or to bring in one more voice very quickly, who you can see there, because I think a lot of people are thinking on similar lines, and I think this is helping us understand the language and imagery, and more to come, is Hannah Arendt, who in 1961, in her essay on What is Freedom, wrote in very much this spirit, the infinitely improbable constitutes the texture of everything we call real. Basically because our existence as human beings is really infinitely improbable. We probably shouldn't exist in all of the richness of what humanity is. And so, she argues, we need to look for the unforeseeable and unpredictable, to be prepared for and expect miracles in the political realm, even though, and this is a key phrase, the scales are weighted in favor of disaster. All of this speaks, I think, very strongly of 1917, of Russia in 1917, about how we might understand those wings and those angels and what the revolution sought and what the revolution accomplished. So let's go back to the streets of revolution in 1917. The first days of freedom, the days after the Tsar fell, they called them days of freedom. Eventually some called them a springtime of freedom. People acted like it was a time of miracle, exactly as Hannah Arendt said people should now and then. People poured into the streets, they embraced one another, people were kissing strangers. According to one writer named Viktor Shklovsky, he said, it was just like Easter, a naive, joyous, disorderly carnival paradise. Postcards, actually, real Easter was coming just down another few weeks to go in March, and postcards like this were quite common, right? Again, surprising at first glance, but shouldn't be, where you have a rooster crowing the dawn, everybody likes the rising sun, standing on a giant red Easter egg saying the freedom of Russia, and up in the corner it says, Christ is risen, which is the Easter greeting. All of that, revolution, freedom, and I've got other images that are very similar to that, was all normal. It was how people thought and felt about the time. Or another example, there's you see quoted here, an 18-year-old woman, a working class woman. She worked in a Moscow factory in 1917. She said, the revolution was like a wonderful holiday. We were happy. We felt like adults for the first time. For the first time, we felt completely free. These are very common, or just one more example of this feeling of miracle. Here's a journalist writing in a very popular, one of the most popular and widely read newspapers in Moscow in March, just the week after the Tsar abdicated. And this is part of what it says. It's a very long article, and it's really pretty amazing. No longer does the vision of the new Russia appear as merely a future promise. It now appears as a real possibility, as a wide horizon. The great Russian Revolution, so quickly, so unexpectedly, like oxygen to a dying man, came to save the Russian people at the very moment when those in authority, frankly, everybody, did not expect it. All revolutions come unexpectedly. You'd think this author had been reading Hannah Arendt and Marx and Benjamin, maybe Marx, but probably not, and certainly Arendt and Benjamin hadn't even written those things. Same idea, right? Break into the world of infinite probability, a historical leap in the open air. Sorry, back to the quote. This is the real grandeur of their arrival. They are born spontaneously. In Russian, that means like the elements. They are born spontaneously, they fly in like a hurricane, and tear out freedom for the exhausted people. As it was, so it shall be. Letters and petitions to people in authority often talked about the revolution as resurrection, as sacred time of transcendence, as salvation, and the like. Now, it's really tempting to say, all right, everything you just told us about March, April, maybe, because that's after the February Revolution. The Tsar fell, a bunch of liberals, but really left-wing liberals, came to power. Eventually, moderate socialists joined them. There were workers' councils that were freely elected. The sense of freedom, and everybody was using the word freedom, the sense of freedom was so extensive, so intense, that one might say that all of that I've just described really only applies to February. Then it's all downhill. Then comes October, which brought Lenin to power, and Bolsheviks, and dictatorship. But I'd actually suggest that this is even more in the spirit of October. And the reason is because to me, and I think to them, most importantly, the darkness of the lived moment, to borrow that phrase from Ernst Bloch, the darkness of the lived moment was far greater in October than in February. The collapsing economy was worse. The war was unending and more bloody and horrible and seemingly pointless than ever. The state was frankly ineffective to accomplish anything except a lot of high ideals and continuing the war. Disappointment in the outcome of the revolution, which could have, one might have said the revolution happened, there shouldn't have been another one. Disappointment was palpable. In fact, despair was very widespread across the population, especially in the lower classes. Everybody now is not talking by late fall, by mid-fall. They're not talking about hope and transformation. What they're talking about is chaos and catastrophe and disaster are all around us, and we are powerless to do anything about it. It almost sounds, again, like quoting a catastrophe that kept piling and hurling wreckage in front of the angel of history's feet. And so large numbers of urban lower-class people were willing to embrace the seemingly impossible. The odds were clearly against ever solving this situation, but they didn't despair. Many people started making demands. All power to the Soviets. Let the people rule. Somehow it'll work out. People understood the odds were in favor of disaster, of catastrophe, but they leapt anyway into believing, and inspired by their belief, in the infinitely improbable but essential. And we see this everywhere. On the streets, among intellectuals, we see it in demands for power to the people, power to the Soviets. We see it in this idea of the government should exclude the bourgeoisie, all elites. We see it in ideas about factories should be run by workers. Who needs managers and owners? We see it in ideas among peasants. The farms should be controlled by those who work it. Who needs managers? Who needs owners? Who needs landlords? We see it among national minorities who talk about we can be completely free to express all our ethnic characteristics, our distinct culture, and be in solidarity with all those other ethnic groups. Unity and diversity. You could see it in women's demands that they be treated as full human beings in public life as well as in their homes, that they be completely equal to men. This, frankly, people felt is how the world should be. And therefore, and this is part of the spirit of a revolutionary moment, if it should be that way, it could be that way, even if, to borrow Arendt again, it was infinitely improbable. This belief was also very strikingly evident among Bolshevik leaders and activists. And there's a lot to say about the utopian impulse among their leaders, though it's worth saying they all said, we're not utopians. Utopian is fantasy. We're for realism. And I want to emphasize the utopian vision of three people very briefly, and then so I can conclude. And in order to have more time for discussion and also focus, I'm just going to talk about the weird way in which these three Bolsheviks dreamed of the Superman, the exact same Nietzschean flying Superman. Very briefly. First is Lev Trotsky. You've all heard of him. Who said at one point in 1904, anybody who thinks that the world does not have to be the way it is, who thinks that the way it is the only way it can be, is nothing but a Philistine. And because in a time of revolution, the masses are aroused. As he says, the incredible becomes real. The impossible becomes believable. Now, 20 years later, he learned a lot about human beings, about darkness, about hardships, about necessity. And that's when he writes this. He has this vision of, as he says, the physical and spiritual, transforming the human person, physically, spiritually, is the ultimate goal of communism. It's the music of the future. And he says, of course, you can't really imagine, we're too stuck in our time to imagine what that music of the future will really sound like. But we can believe that something totally unimaginable will happen. And he offers this speculation about the human being of the future. Man, the human person, will become incomparably stronger, smarter, and more subtle. His body will become more harmonized, his movements more rhythmic, his voice more musical. The average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, a Marx, and above the ridge, new peaks will rise. Or Alexandra Kollontai. Kollontai was certainly the most prominent woman in the Bolshevik leadership. She was probably the Marxist most interested in creating a new human being, but they all talked about it. But she wrote a lot about it. She also said, this is back in 1905, we can't imagine the future. We're stuck in our own time. It's impossible to totally visualize what a future human being will be like. And yet, I'm sure, she said, that in the renewed social atmosphere that we will see in the future, a higher moral type of person, now inaccessible to us, will emerge. And this new person, she described, and these are her words, as the harmonious, whole, strong, and beautiful image of the true Superman. Now, she admitted you can only have pale glimmerings, that's her phrase, of that future, sort of like Benjamin's flashes of messianic time. But that belief, those flashes, those glimmerings, are the one thing that will, one might say, power you to be able to take a leap toward what is clearly the future that you can't even imagine, much less is the improbable. But to know that the improbable does not mean the impossible. Or finally, this guy. Surely there is nobody, no human being, but certainly no Russian poet, who is more determined to, again, borrowing now back to Benjamin, to blast open the continuum of history and fly literally into the free and open air of possibility than Vladimir Mayakovsky. In fact, Vladimir Mayakovsky was so determined to blast open the continuum of history, though again, I'm using later words to describe things that he thought and felt. He once declared that commercial publishers wouldn't publish his or any of his fellow radical futurists' books because, I quote from Mayakovsky, the capitalist nose smelled dynamite on us. To give one example, in his 1916 poem called The Human Being, Человек, usually translated as man, Vladimir Mayakovsky, he's the lead character of his own story, is shackled and captive in a world where money rules. And by the way, many of Mayakovsky's poems feature a hero known as Mayakovsky. And the thing about it is in a way, he's thinking in those philosophical terms. I'm suggesting he's not that guy. He's not the Vladimir Mayakovsky who's trapped in the world of the present. He's the Mayakovsky who's, as a writer, can transcend above his ordinary self. He's not living in ordinary space and time because he's reimagined himself. One might say he's the Superman, imagining different from his own ordinary man. So this Vladimir Mayakovsky, Superman, is in this foaming ocean of money. He writes, you can see some of these words, geniuses, hens, horses, and violins drown. A good description of most societies. Our protagonist, Mayakovsky, has a way to escape. A difficult way, a dark way. Namely, he thinks of committing suicide. And at the very moment he thinks of suicide, his body ascends to heaven. This section of the poem is actually called The Ascension of Mayakovsky, using the religious Russian word. And then, of course, as he's rising up to heaven, everybody's saying, wow, they're like stopped in their tracks, seeing this flying human being. he goes to heaven and he comes back thousands and thousands of years later because he's sure, in the time will have changed the world. He comes back thousands of years later, and what does he find? Nothing has changed at all. The world is exactly what he left. But then comes 1917. Remember, he was writing that before the war. Then comes 1917, and Mayakovsky is elated. He thinks this is it. This is the explosion of time. As he said, the 1,000-year-old before has been shattered, has been smashed to bits, has been blown up with dynamite. Suddenly it says he seemed possible. He literally says this, thank you, Vladimir, because it's the image I keep harping on. He said that it became possible to leap into the future. No more marching, it's time to leap into the future. But again, that was 1917, 1918. Time, the old time refuses to let go. So Mayakovsky thinks, well, then we need more violence. Not literal violence. For many, this is the Civil War. Many are using literal violence to blow up the old time. For Mayakovsky, it's very poetic, but it's still connected to the times. You can see a quote from him in 1919. We can't just fantasize about the old order. We have to dynamite. He likes dynamite. We have to dynamite the old. Scorch, burn, cut, raze. If it's old, kill it. We must kick down the fence of time. One might say literally people were doing that in the midst of the Civil War while he poeticizes about it. The trouble is, the fence of time did not fall. It didn't even break. But in 1920, he said, on the other hand, it was covered in slime. And this is where I'll conclude. So we know how the revolution turned out. We know what happened as the continuum of time, the march of time continued. Or as Ernst Bloch himself wrote, he wrote a book in 1918 called The Spirit of Utopia. He re-edited the book in 1923, and he added one line among many others, and he said, yes, doors opened, but of course, they soon shut. And one might say, if we're continuing with our leaping metaphors, our conceptual metaphors, we might say wings were clipped, and angels were suppressed, and venturing beyond, for that matter, beyond the darkness was just banned. One might say necessity reigned supreme, as well as a great deal of dictatorship and brutality and suffering. Though to be sure, to be fair, given enough time, the economy recovered, there's more security, there's cultural development, there's equality for most people, except for the power elite, but not the kingdom of freedom. So in this light, frankly, it would be easy to be depressed, as many at the time were, to say that the only smart thing, if you're smart, you don't dream of transforming the world. That's for naive utopians. The idea that, yes, we desire the good, we desire change, we desire justice, we desire happiness, it's just an illusion. It's just a fantasy in a world that is fundamentally one of inevitable ruin, inevitable loss. In other words, the scales really are tilted in favor of disaster. And history really does keep piling wreckage and hurling it at our feet. And I'm using the present tense on purpose. But back to 1917, it seems to me that it's critically important as understanding the past, but also for thinking about our own present and our own future, that the winged leap in 1917 was enough. It defined people's sense of the real. And perhaps, in that sense, Trotsky was right. The illusion is to keep thinking that the way the world is the only way it can be. To fail to think that just because the world should be that way, that it also isn't true that it can be that way. To really understand the past, to really understand the Russian Revolution, maybe to think about ourselves, it's essential to read history, especially the history of the Russian Revolution, not from the outcomes, but from the richness of its own possibilities. Thank you.
We'll be taking questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
And I understand there's a microphone over here.
Yeah, have one in the back.
I guess they decide who asks questions because they have the microphone.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your excellent talk.
There you are.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Your talk made me think of many things, certainly about Icarus. There's another metaphor for that great winged leap. And
Which metaphor?
Icarus.
Icarus, yes.
Yeah, what happened? Well, bad news for him. And also, of course, what people may not know, the fate of Mayakovsky himself, who the depression did hit him, or reality hit him, and he succumbed to suicide.
Yes.
But I was just curious, why in drag? Could you comment on Mayakovsky, what it meant to him to appear in drag at that particular moment, what he was thinking and doing, as much as you may know about it?
To appear?
In drag. Sorry if this, maybe, is this on?
Yeah, At what moment are you thinking? I mean, one might say it's a question of how you define drag, but
okay.
I think his sense of costuming his body in outrageous ways that counter the normative, to use a phrase we might use now, I think was essential to challenging reality as it is. So, he'd come into a club and he'd be wearing, strange yellow shirt, a vest made of two pieces that were sewn together, anything that challenged your sense of normative. He loved wearing top hats and painting his face, right? So I think you can call it drag or not call it drag. That's another discussion. But I think the idea of in every gesture, it's like he'd come into a club and he'd have to be really, really loud, when he read his poetry. If it hurt your ears, better. He would throw things at people. I'm not going to do that. I have no tea in my pocket, but he used to throw tea and worse at people. Anything he called it waking up the Philistines, right? Or as he liked to call them, the pharmacists. That was his sort of phrase, like metaphor. Yeah, pharmacists, who could be more Philistine than that? I think the idea of sorry if you're any pharmacists here, of waking people up from their sense of what is possible. I think in that sense, Mayakovsky is speaking totally in the tradition of all of these utopians, as I'm describing, who are insisting you can't lose sight of the possible, however the odds seem to be against it. I think that's what he's doing through his own body all the time. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. I visited the exhibit before attending this talk, and as I listened to your description of this kind of non-rational impulse, this messianic moment in Russian history, I was struck by the contrast with the emphasis on the rational, the controlled representation of lines and planes, the use of the elements of industry, for example, in the aesthetics of constructivism. And so I'm wondering whether these two movements are in competition with each other, or do you believe that constructivism fits within this idea of the utopian?
So there are people in this room who are far more expert about constructivism and those very artists in the exhibit than I am. But as I've seen this stuff many, many times over many, many years, and it's really exciting to be in the physical presence of it. And to take one example, if you walk through the spatial constructions section, which, you might think these are highly rational geometric structures, but when you just stand there amidst these spatial constructions floating, whether they're standing but curving, to me, what I thought was the openness of space, the openness of possibility, a sort of ethereal way in which material objects, because for constructivists, the materiality is essential. It's sort of like Marxist materialism. They said, well, that's a little boring. Let's make it materialityism, as it were. Let's think of the material object and free it from all of its conventional moorings in the normative, to talk about, Mayakovsky and others as an example. So I react to it, and other experts can tell you better, but I react to that as a sense of freeing even simple material objects, metal, wood, iron, freeing it from its conventional moorings in ordinary reality. So I think those images fit exactly with the spirit of what is articulated. Yeah, that's not true in 1930, but it is true in the early 1920s. Well, there's people down front, too. There's the front row, too, I see.
I think we're
Yeah.
So a lot of the evidence that you showed were from people on the streets or poets or philosophers. So did Lenin have these views as well, or did he just luck into people thinking what he was saying was going to carry them to this utopia?
Lenin's an interesting case here. And there's a weird way, if any of you read my book, one of the things a couple of reviewers, there aren't many yet, have noticed is, hey, where's Lenin? Lenin does cameo appearances in my history of the Russian Revolution. He shows up, he says a few things, he steps off. He shows up again, and I do that on purpose because I think there's a weird way, yeah, Lenin was a hugely important figure in what ultimately happened, but actually for most of the time until they came to power, he was fairly marginal. His party wasn't the main party. And within the party, there were endless debates about the revolution and how to go about things. When it becomes possible, there are utopian moments in Lenin, that is to say, moments in which he let himself feel almost lyrical about the possibilities of transforming the world. One of them is just like months before the revolution, because he actually thinks that a further revolution is impossible. And so he says, I think I'll write a real serious scholarly book about the state and revolution, because we're not going to have a revolution in my lifetime. Then it happens a couple months later, a month after we published this book. For Lenin, apart from those moments, well, one of the things that happens in 1917 is that's one of those moments where he said, oh my God, it's like, what has just happened? When the thing about people in authority least expected it, that's February. You could say that's also true for Lenin in October of 1917. And so when it happens, what do you hear from Lenin? You keep hearing him say things like, oh my God, the forces of the people are unleashed. They will, he uses the word, they will be able to perform miracles, miracles of creativity. So he has this moment, and for that reason, he's willing to say, oh yeah, you want to put this crazy, angel on the wall of the Kremlin. He actually didn't like the cantata. He said, guys, that's a bit much. There's a little bit too much resurrection and salvation. Can you tone it down? And they said no, and they said, all right, whatever. Lenin was really, one might say he was, at that moment, so infatuated with the unleashing quality of the revolution that he accepted all of that. Very quickly, there's a book by Richard Stites called Utopian Dreams, or Revolutionary Dreams, in which he starts referring to Lenin's frown. And I think there's a certain truth to that. Lenin started frowning about this stuff. And by the mid-1920s, it's being pushed to the wayside. As one cultural minister said, I think in 1920, he said, comrades, this is not our language. So from above, they're saying, we can't think this way. And one might say, parallel to crushing this sort of visionary artistic spirit. And you go upstairs, and you can see the difference between 1920 and 1930 in these sort of visionary qualities. I think as the artistic, creative, poetic side is being reined in by Lenin's frown and the party and the state's frown. It's also happening in all sorts of other political areas of life that historians are more likely to talk about. So I think Lenin is momentarily impressed and lets it go and quickly says, no, this isn't how we're going to build a new society.
Okay, we have time for just one more question, but as a reminder, we will have a book signing just outside of the room, out here. Books are also still for sale out there if you haven't purchased one yet. And our final question here. Could I please answer? Sure.
Yes, you had that quote by Leon Trotsky earlier. Did Joseph Stalin share those same kinds of views of idealism and so forth at that time?
So there's the Stalin, it's like there's many Lenins, there's many Trotskys. Trotsky was really a piece of work, by the way. He could do some terrible things, and he could rise to the heights of lyric beauty like that. Stalin a little less so, but on the other hand, I think it's fair to say that the Stalin of 1936 is not the same as the Stalin of 1930, where he imagines we can speed up the course of history and transform everything. Mass industrialization. You say we can only have 200,000 tons of steel coming out of your factory, double it. And one might say it's because he lost his mind. No, it's because the impossible was no longer off the agenda. For him, it had to do with industrialization, it had to do with industry, it has to do with production, but it still was the impossible. Of course we could achieve it, because Bolsheviks can do everything in the midst of revolution. You can have Stalin in the middle of the 1920s where he's saying, we're getting really dull, there's no inspiration. So he's feeling that in a very different way. He hated all this stuff, though. This was not his style, until he discovered you can bring that same sense of a savior, of transformation, of rising from the dead through him as a type of Superman figure. So there's many Stalins, and some of them have that same drive. It's just, frankly, it's not aimed at the kingdom of freedom. It's aimed somewhere else. But it has that same sense of the leap, of the incredible possibility. The end was a different one, I think. Thanks.